Next speaker is Tony Gosling. I'll just read out who Tony is. Tony has worked as a researcher and journalist for BBC local radio stations, publishing online research on the Bilderberg conferences. After coordinating Oxford's The Land is Ours, a land rights campaign in the 1990s, including Wandsworth, St George's Hill, diggers' occupations, he is now a freelance investigative radio journalist and writer based in Bristol. So
does anyone here remember Greater London Radio? Because that's where I worked back in the early 1990s in Marylebone High Street, which was quite an interesting, busy newsroom. I think one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough to do with land rights is land tenure. What is your rights on that land? What are they? Whether it's a freehold, a leasehold, or what they used to have, the traditional type of land tenure was a copyhold. That equivalent of the copyhold still exists in Scotland today in the crofting movement, which is passed on from one person in the family to another. The great thing about that is it means you can't put that property up as collateral against a bank loan and you can't lose it. So that's the key thing about the old copyholds, which were a part of the open field system, the pre-enclosure way that land was used. And I don't think there's enough understanding of the rights and the way in which, you know, the deal basically by which we hold land. But the other thing is with land, you can't, I don't think, talk about it without thinking about money at the same time and the money system and the way the money's used. Because it's kind of, as you're deprived of your land, you become more dependent on the money system. And it's interesting how the English Civil War, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, it was after the English Civil War that the Bank of England was incorporated and that the money system really started to take a hold of us, because before that, land was a free gift to mankind, and it was seen like that generally amongst the public. This is a free gift for everybody and we've got to share it. Anybody that decides that they're going to exclude people from it is wrong. Now, the diggers in the English Civil War talked about it as a common treasury for all, but basically the same thing. So if you start privatising land, if you start saying I own it, and that's what this title of this meeting is about today, who owns the land? Originally it was the divine right of kings, so the king and the feudal system held the land in God's name for us. But this is a crucial thing to, I think, to understanding, and many cultures around the world still, particularly, for example, the Brazilian landist movement, the MST, understand this very well. This is something that is not like a car or a wheel or something you produce yourself. This is something which we have to hold in trust. So that's the key thing, I think, in understanding anything to do with land rights and ownership is we don't own land. Land is not property like anything else. We have to share it if we're going to survive as a species, which, you know, looking at the situation now, God knows whether we will or not. The other thing about houses is how much do they cost to build and how much do they cost to buy? The separation of the two is getting greater and greater and greater. And so we're being excluded from the idea of, I mean, how much does it cost to build a semi-detached house? Something like probably £70,000, £80,000 in terms of materials and man hours, woman hours, whatever, to build it. It costs something like that. But to buy it in London now, well, it's, you know, we're getting into a fancy land, and at some point that bubble is going to reset. It's got to reset. We can't carry on like this forever with these artificially high house prices. So as for the campaign, The Land is Ours, after I'd finished at the BBC, I went on to help organise a protest in Wandsworth in 1996, which lasted for 6 months by the side of Wandsworth Bridge. The idea there being that it was a Guinness site which was derelict. There were plans for luxury houses. It was great fun as well, because we organised coaches on a magical mystery tour, and about 300, 400 people turned up on the site and took over the site within the space of a day or a few hours. And we held on to it for 6 months and built little eco shacks, and in fact we had about 20, 25 people living there. The meetings there were pretty interesting. We had a daily meeting where there were about half the number of people there in the room here, in a big circle, deciding how we were going to manage the land and deal with various difficulties. And it was a street drinking area, so it wasn't easy managing the fact that there were so many casualties from society, damaged people turning up on site who needed somewhere to live. And then St George's Hill in 1999 was more fun again. That was going right into the heart of the beast. Anyone that knows anything about the English Civil War and what happened to St George's Hill, which is where the diggers in 1649 decided to do a little protest, which sort of echoes through history, is now like the Beverly Hills of Britain, a private gated estate. And so we went into there, we trespassed onto the land, much to the consternation of the police, and brought a mobile village in a little truck and managed to get that past their security too. So we set up in there for about 10 days. But I mean, the idea really is political theatre. Let's do things which actually have a resonance and draw people in to discuss the issues and have a bit of fun at the same time. Maybe, you know, doing something which is a little bit of civil disobedience. Actually, the local cops after were almost sorry to see us go because it was an excuse to engage, sit around the fire, chat about stuff. And we added a bit of life to St George's Hill. There were even people living up there who were coming to us and saying, "Thank God you're here, because we've got the Russian mafia moving in and we'd like to chat to someone about it and we don't like it up here anymore and the character is changing." So there was all sorts of stuff that came out just by doing something like that. And of course we're in a crazy situation where so much land isn't registered. In order to find out who owns a piece of land, you have to squat it. Once you squat it, you get court papers and you find out who owns it. And that's the only way. The land registry won't tell you. And then you have a very close look at the deeds and, all right, is this fake or what? Is this real? So anyway, after that, I started looking into these Bilderberg conferences because someone came up to me at Wandsworth and said, this is an interesting organisation. And I was a bit annoyed at never having heard of them. And so I just put up some membership lists I got from Reuters' internal article database on the internet, and things went crazy from there on, really. I mean, there's a whole website I built up over the years. But really, the Bilderberg conferences are the kind of other end of the spectrum, if you want. It's a kind of corporate, NATO, arms industry, banking, political lobby, but within the NATO countries, pretty much, that they have their own ideas about the way they want the world to go, and they're not our ideas. They're certainly much more towards the corporate end of things, and they're the people that are pushing this privatisation, the privatisation of land, into things like, I mean, they privatised the water. They have privatised the water, I think, haven't they? As much as they can, they want us to pay for those basic things that we need in life, and that is totally against my principles. We should have all the basics, and then they should be taxing the luxuries. Absolutely fine. Tax a yacht by all means, but don't tax bread. Don't tax the land. These are basic, fundamental principles of any decent human being, in my view. And I think also with the Bilderbergs, it's well worth looking into these people because the organisation was chaired for the first 20 years, from the mid-50s to the mid-70s, by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who was a former SS officer. They are supposedly representing us, and they're representing the United States and all these countries, and yet there you've got this guy who slipped off his SS uniform and he's chairing the meeting. I mean, he then married into the Dutch royal family, and I would argue that he was one of the traitors with the Arnhem campaign back in 1944, the disastrous attempt to liberate Holland. He sent in a guy who was supposed to be helping us to liaise with the Dutch resistance, and it turned out to be he went straight to the Abwehr. He turned out to be a Nazi agent. So, but Bernhard, a bit of a dodgy character, and then also Lord Carrington, who was also involved in the Arnhem battle. He then also later went on to chair the Bilderberg conferences. So, I mean, I do take this quite dualistic point of view. You know, there's us and then there's them. Also, going a bit more back into the history, I think trying to get a historical view is critical here in understanding how we got in the mess we are today. So, 1086, thank you very much, the Norman yoke, right? Doomsday Book. Please remember, when they started going around this country, basically doing a catalogue of an inventory of everything everyone was doing so they could tax it, there were riots in certain parts of Britain where they said, we're not having this. This is not what we want government to do after the Normans had taken over. And there was immense efforts to stop them compiling this Doomsday Book as well in different parts of Britain. So if you're going to take a little flight through history, very important, I think, also to look at events like Kett's Rebellion in East Anglia in 1549, massive anti-enclosure rebellion stopping privatisation of land by Robert Kett. And I noticed there's still stuff in and around Norwich. If you're ever up there, there's a whole load of kind of memories of that, where the entire East Anglia was being run from underneath an oak tree for about 2 months. And the king sent an army against them, and the peasants beat the army back, and the king had to send a second army against them. So they were saying, look, this is not private property. This is common land. Get out of the way, king. But unfortunately, Robert Kett was hanged off of the, I think it was by chains off the walls of Norwich. So he came a cropper like many of these people do eventually. But fascinating bit of history and very important. Then we come to the English Civil War, which I mentioned briefly earlier on. And I would just have to wave this in front of your noses. If anyone's ever seen this book or ever come across it, it's N.H. Brailsford's book, The Levellers and the English Revolution. Because Christopher Hill's done a great job with The World Turned Upside Down. But this is also a really beautiful piece of research into the nuts and bolts of what was really going on in the Civil War, because of course it was a con. The whole thing was a way of getting everybody to fight the king, and that's really the key of what I wanted to say today is, and there's a little handout I've got here for anyone who wants to see me afterwards. I would posit that the reason the Civil War happened was because enclosure, privatisation of land, had been being stopped by James I and Charles I. And I'll just read you a short quote from a book, The English Village Community and the Enclosure Movements, from 1967. From about 1607 to 1636, the government pursued an active anti-enclosure policy. If the reign in its social and agrarian policy might be judged solely from the number of anti-enclosure commissions set up, then undoubtedly King Charles I is the one English monarch of outstanding importance as an agrarian reformer. What Charles I was doing is he was saying, well, hang on a minute, these people are, we've got our peasants living under ditches across the country, and we're not having this, and these merchant classes that were doing this privatisation, the enclosure, are making a fortune. I'm going to tax them. His big mistake, though, Charles I, was that he actually started fining and taxing people. They called them, composures or something, I'm not sure exactly what. Anyway, had a different compositions, they called them, the fines, were imposed on landowners who had enclosed their land 3 or 4 years before, while it was still legal. But he was still imposing fines on those people who'd done it years before. Now, if I was a merchant and I'd enclosed my land, privatised my land, kicked off the peasants and turned it over to my own private property to make money and grow food or whatever, sheep often, I would be rather pissed off with the king for fining me for doing something that 3 years ago was perfectly legal. And I think that's one of the reasons that the merchant classes at the beginning of the Civil War started to get organised against the king and say, we're not having this. Also, we're on a nice little number. The other thing, of course, is, remember, at the time was beginning of the urbanisation of factories. And so all these landless peasants were coming into the cities and working in factories and beginning to be the sort of, beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, or at least the very first start. I mean, we're talking about the Agricultural Revolution there, really. So I think that's one of the big reasons. In a way, Winstanley and the Diggers did a great job, I think, in picking up on this, even though they maybe didn't realise what had been going on behind the scenes in the run-up to the Civil War. One thing I would also point to is the 1880s, a rather big time in land rights, because you've got the Irish Land League and the Scottish Highland Clearances. The Irish Land League, to answer Fiona in a way, is a really good example of how you do it, because in Ireland, they had what the Lib Dems at the moment would be absolutely, be gagging for, which is they held the balance of power, the Irish MPs, and they used the balance of power in the 1880s to do what? To push for government loans to buy and build their own homes in Ireland. And so what happened was people were getting cheap loans because remember we just had the famines, for goodness sake, to take the land off of the hands of the absentee landowners and to own their own homes. It's why Ireland now is such a lot of small peasant farmers, peasants, but small farmers all over the place. It's because they managed to get that out of the settlement for the coalition government that they went into. They said, we'll support you. I think it was the Whigs they were supporting, but only if you get us this. And what they did is they turned all those leases that they had in Ireland over into private ownership. And that's a really good example, a very simple way of how you redistribute land and you stop rack renting landowners. In Scotland, it was probably even as horrific, with people being torn out of their homes in the Highland Clearances. But I would, I suppose, like to finish with just a couple of book recommendations. This Land Is Our Land is one of the best, Marion Short. I am actually managed to get my mother-in-law to republish it because I'd waited for 3 months to get a copy of this from a library in South London, and there were 3 people before me who were in the queue. So my mother-in-law's a publisher. I said, why don't you republish it? And Marion Short's book's fantastic, forward by George Monbiot. This Land Is Our Land, A Struggle for Britain's Countryside. Terrific read, good old Marion. And the other one is this present publication, which Simon Fairley down in Devon publishes every quarter, I think, which is the Land magazine, which you might even see an article by me in here from time to time, which is really kind of keeping track of, I suppose, a sort of what they call low-impact development, which is people who have decided that they want to live lightly on the earth. So I think that'll do. As regards campaigning, The Land Is Ours still sort of exists, but ultimately I think the real inheritors of Gerrard Winstanley, the Irish Land League, the people that fought the Highland clearances, I see them all across our urban cities. They are the squatters, the people who have not given in to Ken Clarke and said we're not going to squat places because we're not allowed to squat residential anymore. They're squatting industrial buildings, they're squatting anything that's not residential, but they're still squatting. And there are hundreds of thousands of them across this country that keep their heads down. They're Winstanley's people today. Thanks for listening.